There we go. Welcome everybody to the March 2021 OWASP Virtual Meetup. Anyone who's been on before know that myself, Nathan Britton, who's one of the leaders, with my colleague Jim Gumbley, who will also be speaking as well later on. So just a quick bit of admin. Obviously we are recording, hope that's okay. We've got 2 talks lined up, and if you've got any questions, we'll be keeping an eye on the chat window, so fire them in there. I can keep an eye on them, and we'll ask them of the 2 speakers when appropriate at the end of their talks, or even just put your hand up and you can ask questions direct. But I'll be monitoring the chat. We'll just go through a bit of, like I said, bit of the admin. We do have social media, so please, if you're not already, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, obviously Meetup. Hopefully you've all joined because of that, and we do have a YouTube channel as well, which has got previous recordings on there, and we'll get this recording on over the next few days as well. And of course, the slides as well we'll make available. So I'm sure most of you, I recognise quite a few of the names actually, so I'm sure most of you understand, but again, just to update those who are perhaps new to OWASP, if not OWASP Birmingham. So we are a free, open community all around being a more secure world, a more secure landscape. And in fact, the last 12 months, I think, has only heightened the awareness around security and cybersecurity and AppSec. So that's what we're here for. We're all volunteers, and we're here hopefully to promote a more secure application landscape. It's always free. These videos, these webinars are free. Meetups, hopefully, when life gets back to some sort of normality, the meetups will happen in person. Perhaps even this year we'll get to have to be all in person. Obviously, the beauty of virtual is you could be anywhere in the world at the moment watching this, which is obviously great for OWASP and great for OWASP Birmingham as well to help spread our message. But it's all free, apart from the conferences, training. But by being a member, you will get discounts. So if you do the training, your $50 that you pay to be an OWASP member is one of the perks. You'll get that straight away. So if you do want to do some OWASP training, becoming a member does get you some discount as well to offset that. So I would recommend, if you're not members, to consider joining. It helps run the whole OWASP community. And without further ado, I want to just go through the agenda of today. So we're going to start off with the first talk from a repeat talker, friend of the family, or friend of the show, as radio programs often say. So F5 Labs Dave Warburton, who's going to talk about, well, HTTPS really. More and more of us in our day-to-day lives are using or have been using HTTPS with anger. You know, it's been skyrocketing over the last few years, but hey, so are the bad guys out there. So Dave's probably going to level set how it's not a panacea, but what the bad guys are doing with over HTTPS, and hoping to see a new or fairly new tool, a new application, and demoing. Should the demo gods be kind to us? We'll have a break in between. Could be 5-10 minutes depending on timings, but we'll have a comfort break, a drink break in between. And then, well, OWASP co-leader Jim will do a talk on threat modeling, specifically around introduction to threat modeling, especially for your developers, how you might look to start threat modeling, a really important part of the shift left kind of buzzword, I suppose, but really important that we start, if not already, designing security in from the beginning, and threat modeling is a great way to do that, great way of collaborating. Actually, probably more challenging over in the new world, you know, no standing in front of a whiteboard like perhaps Jim would have done and other developers, but I'm sure that can still be achieved remotely as well. So looking forward to that. Kind of puts pressure on me to do a talk at some point as well. So then at the end, any Q&As, if there's any overhang with questions, then we'll bring them up there. Dave may not be around, for the whole of it. So if you've got burning questions for Dave, try and get them in during his talk so he can answer them. He's always good to answer those. So and then we'll close roughly at 8 o'clock and let you be on your way. So I think we'll go straight into it, Dave. I think I've made you co-host. So
cool. Let's see. So I think I'm going to forcibly stop you from sharing your screen.
You do that. You do that.
So I do quite like kicking people off. Right. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yep. All done.
Cool. Yeah, hopefully I should be able to stick around to the end. So by all means, fire questions over as and when we go. I will let Jim and Nathan maybe moderate and fire, maybe interrupt or let you come off mute, what have you, or equally send them to the end. I really don't mind. So to kick off, yeah, so I spend a lot of time, and I've been kind of geeking out for years about kind of crypto, and I can't profess to be an expert by any means, but I find it fascinating. Went back to uni to study, amongst many other things, cryptography, and it's kind of led to me now becoming the main author of a report that we put out from F5 Labs every year, or maybe a year and a half, called Tls Telemetry. And as part of this kind of research where we scan the web looking for how people are deploying HTTPS and SSL and TLS, and then writing reports and commenting on trends. To make my job easier, we actually developed a brand new tool to do it, and that's what we're going to finish off the talk with today, introducing that tool to anyone that hasn't seen it yet, showing you how that maybe you can use it, and the different kind of use cases that it might be useful for. So let's kick off with a few slides first. So what we're going to do is just spend a couple of minutes just going through effectively the latest report, looking at the kind of trends and how people are deploying HTTPS configurations. But before we get to that, anyone that doesn't know who F5 Labs are, hopefully most of you know F5 networks, 20 odd years ago, load balancing, and these days, hopefully more, better known as, being application security provider, both on-prem products and so on. But that's not me anymore. I'm glad to say I'm not sales. I'm in the F5 Labs team, and we are a group of threat researchers. We're completely agnostic to F5's products and solutions. So if you were to go to f5labs.com, you will not see any mention of the kind of products and solutions that we have. Now, that might be to our kind of detriment. Sometimes it's useful, but actually the research and the writing we do, we want to be useful to anyone, not just F5 customers. So as it happens, I'm an ex-F5 solutions engineer. We've got some ex-F5 cert engineers on the team, but we also have CISOs from previous companies. We've got geopolitical and data scientists as part of the team as well. So we really try and make it, as agnostic as we can. Now, to do the research that we do, we kind of pull in data from inside F5, that's from the CERT, from our own IT security teams, from the SOC. We get data from some of the new companies we've acquired, like Shape, Nginx, and recently Volterra. And we also have partnerships with external companies from the likes of Webroot, Fluxio, who have like thousands of honeypots that collect data for us worldwide. And we're also part of the GitHub Security Alliance as well. So that's a bit about who we are and what we do. So on to the Tls Telemetry Report. Well, as Nathan said, the vast majority of the web now is encrypted. This stat, which I produced, is about a year and a bit old, actually. It's not growing rapidly anymore, but I suspect it's far nearer to 90% than 86%. And this is like a weighted average of traffic of over Firefox and Chrome browsers. But suffice to say that the vast majority of web traffic is becoming encrypted. So it's really important, I think, that we've got a strong HTTPS deployments, well-configured TLS ciphers and keys and so on. Now, it's always interesting talking to kind of different groups of people, and I think even for those people, and I include myself in this camp, where I consider myself fairly technical, particularly around infrastructure and web apps. Actually, when you kind of think HTTPS and TLS and you kind of delve under the hood, you realize there's an awful lot more to it than you might have realized. So at a very high level, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page to go through the rest of the findings. TLS is really a kind of multi-protocol. It's like a multifaceted protocol. We've got the initial public key crypto, which involves sending things like ciphers that the client supports, sending certificates, having public key crypto embedded within that certificate to sign it and so on. Once all those things gets exchanged after a few back and forth between the client and the server, we then drop to the symmetric key crypto, which is the stuff, the crypto that actually encrypts the application traffic. So everything before that is just kind of agreeing what key we can use for the symmetric key crypto to then do its thing. Now, what I'm not kind of representing on this slide is that actually there's an awful lot more that goes into a healthy and strong HTTPS deployment these days. We can potentially use DNS records or HTTP headers to kind of improve and shore up any gaps that TLS alone might leave. So it's been a busy couple of years. I mean, this is a very quick, I'm not going to linger on these points, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that TLS and associated protocols, encryption protocols, are constantly evolving. Things very rarely sit still. You can look at protocols like DNSSEC, for example. Now, those kind of things take decades to get any kind of traction, and we're still struggling to get traction with DNSSEC. But actually, when it comes to TLS and SSL, because we've got major browsers, pushing new standards, actually what we're finding is that new protocols and improvements can get implemented and rolled out pretty quickly. So lots of things have happened over the past few years, and I think it is useful to kind of be aware of some of the high-level changes that have occurred. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, and one of the reasons I kind of love talking about cryptography, and really the reason that we all kind of use cryptography to begin with, or HTTPS, is to stop snooping, to stop interception. So I don't know if anyone knew or recalls, from a couple of years ago now, I think it was the end of 2019, around August time, I think, the nation of Kazakhstan tried to intercept the encrypted traffic of a proportion of its citizens. Now, clearly what HTTPS should do is prevent this, because if anyone tries to intercept it, at the very least, you should get a certificate warning. And so what was happening for years was that the Kazakhstan government was petitioning the likes of Firefox and the CA, or the Certificate Alliance and Certificate Authority and Browser Forums, and we're trying to get like the national CA of Kazakhstan embedded into our browsers and operating systems. They were constantly having the door shut in their face, saying, Firefox and the CA and Browser Forum were kind of saying that they perceived it as a security risk. And so in 2019, the Kazakhstan government, using some of the ISPs in the country, started sending emails and text messages to the citizens, asking them to install manually a CA root certificate into browsers and devices. And if people did this and actually installed it, then effectively what would happen is that person using that device would go to one of about, I think it was a dozen to 20 odd sites were being intercepted. And the user wouldn't see a warning because they'd gone and installed the root certificate for Kazakhstan. So as you can see in the example, they might go to google.com, they would get the green padlock, they get a valid HTTPS connection, but actually if they looked at it, they'd see that it wasn't signed by the Google CA, it was signed by quote unquote security certificate, which was the name that Kazakhstan gave to its CA, or the intermediate CA. So this is a big problem. And actually, although we really don't see this very often, nation size kind of interception of HTTPS, it is a concern. But there are also other concerns around encryption. There's law enforcement, there's what ISPs might do to either intercept or attempt to intercept our connections, or use some other kind of methods to try and track our activity. From an outbound point of view, anyone that's maybe possibly not in this group, but for those people that are maybe more on the infrastructure side, using web proxies to filter and inspect outbound traffic for staff members going to the web. The increasing use of encryption makes that more difficult. If you can't perform a valid HTTPS interception, then you can't potentially see the names of the websites that the staff members are going to. You certainly can't see the content that's being leaked or brought back in. There are new protocols coming on. The encrypted DNS has been talked about quite a lot and is being used increasingly. We've got Firefox in the US now enabling DNS over HTTPS by default. Android users can enable it in the operating system. I think there's an app for iOS that effectively does the same thing as well. They can encrypt DNS. So we've got new protocols being encrypted. And then there's just misconfiguration which really is probably one of the key points for today's talk, is that actually, if we don't configure HTTPS properly, then potentially we're allowing attackers an easy way into, intercepting communications and stealing traffic. So anyone that's maybe looked at the Tls telemetry reports that we've put out for the past couple of years will notice a kind of a little shift. And one thing I wanted to figure out when trying to scan the web is, what do we go for? Do we try and go for the entire IPv4 space, or 4 billion endpoints, or 4 billion IP addresses, or do we just maybe go for the top 1 million? And to go on quickly, I won't spend too long on this slide. We've gone for the Alexa top 1 million for a couple of reasons. One, it's a little bit smaller, so it's a bit more manageable when it comes to kind of capturing data and analyzing it. I think also importantly, 4 billion is going to capture an awful lot of IoT devices, or maybe home routers, and whilst it's potentially useful to look at those, really what we're trying to focus on is how enterprises and companies are deploying their HTTPS. But maybe most importantly is, when we're using a top 1 million list, and actually we're moving away from Alexa, but when we're moving a top 1 million list, when we're using it, sorry, we can actually specify the host name or the domain name, which is going to be important, because the more that we have websites hidden behind CDN or proxies that can have, multi-homed, multiple websites behind a single IP address, it's going to be important for us to specify the right domain name to make sure we get the right certificate back and make sure that everything is consistent and working properly. So to jump right into the results, now these data are about a year or so old now. We're working, or I'm currently working on the new Tls Telemetry Report, hopefully due out in a couple of months. And actually in preliminary kind of findings, just over the past few days, actually, I've already seen TLS 1.3 take the lead, only just over TLS 1.2. But roughly this time last year, we were seeing TLS 1.3 around about a third of all kind of IP addresses in the Alexa top 1 million. TLS 1.2 was a significant kind of clear winner, if you like, at 2/3. Now, what was interesting is, again, when I first produced this presentation and talk a while back, the deprecation of TLS 1.0 and 1.1 was shelved because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, Google announced that they were going to kind of halt deprecation of those protocols to allow, people kind of coping with a pandemic and working from home more time to turn off those protocols. But essentially, if you're now using an up-to-date version of Chrome, Firefox, and other major browsers, those browsers won't even attempt to connect to TLS 1.0 and 1.1. So if you're not disabling on your web server, then you're potentially letting some attacker using some kind of script or bot, the chance to connect to those older and weaker protocols. And as another random find, of the third or so of servers that were enabling or allowing TLS 1.3 connections, around about 8% were using fast start. So for those that haven't maybe looked at how the TLS 1.3 protocol has changed, it's definitely an evolution over TLS 1.3. It's not a kind of, over TLS 1.2. It's not a drastic redesign. But one of the things it does is drastically reduce the number of allowed, what we call cyber suites in the protocol. Now the list on the left of TLS 1.2 isn't a full list of all cyber suites. In fact, there are many, many more that are supported in 1.2. These were just the ones that I discovered during the scans. And again, in TLS 1.3, I believe there are about 5 cyber suites that are supported, but in all the scanning I did, I only found about 3 cyber suites in active use across the web. And as you can see from the graph, the vast majority of all kind of handshakes are using the AES algorithm. So that was the kind of symmetric crypto. From a public key crypto, that first kind of handshake, which looks to agree on ciphers, looks to exchange certificates. What we're seeing is a huge preference for ephemeral Diffie-Hellman. Now, what this gives us is something called perfect forward secrecy, or rather, I kind of prefer the term just forward secrecy. So for those that maybe aren't familiar, RSA uses static keys to perform its asymmetric handshake. Now, what that means is, although it's very unlikely that maybe someone can crack a 2K or 4K RSA key, should it be done at some point in the future, every single connection which has used that certificate and that same key can be decrypted at the same time. The nice thing with ephemeral Diffie-Hellman is that because different keys are used for every single handshake, even if one of them is broken in the future by, let's say, some huge nation state with a huge amount of resources, it's only that one connection which has been broken. Every other connection is remains secure, in the sense that each one of those connections will need to be broken separately. So over 90% of servers in the top 1 million prefer forward secret ciphers, but 80% of servers still support RSA. And this is, again, what's important to remember is that in that initial handshake, in the initial asymmetric handshake, it's a negotiation. It's a kind of compromise between client and server. The client saying, well, I support TLS 1.0 and 1.2 and these ciphers, and the server saying, well, I support 1.1 and these ciphers, and then some kind of negotiation happens. So the point being that if RSA is still enabled on your server, it's still possible for a man in the middle or an active attacker to actually, try and connect to server using that RSA handshake. Now, again, I can't profess to be a cryptography expert, but I do find it interesting going to the likes of Real World Crypto in New York back in the days that we can actually go meet face to face. The overwhelming message from the cryptography kind of community is that RSA, from a handshake point of view, is horribly broken, and it should absolutely not be used unless absolutely essential. Now, RSA can still be used to sign certificates. That's very different. But if you have a TLS configuration where RSA is still used as that handshake, it really should be, should be disabled where possible. And this kind of brings us on really to, again, one of the main points of the talk, which is actually misconfiguration is a big part of the problem. These are some stats from an Alert Logic report from a year or two ago, where Alert Logic provides IT and security kind of support to SMEs, and an awful lot of their workload, an awful lot of the cases, bearing in mind it's any kind of IT or security problem that could be logged, the vast majority were to do with encryption or encryption misconfiguration. In some cases, the wrong certificate was applied. In some cases, the self-signed certificates. In some cases, weak or legacy ciphers were still enabled. So although misconfigured HTTPS configurations don't always result in maybe an active attack or an actual breach of data, they are resulting in an awful lot of legwork, an awful lot of work to actually configure them properly. And as you can see from the graphs, I won't spend long on them, although very, very negligible amount, I think below 0.1% of servers prefer SSL v3 in the top 1 million today. About 2 or 3% still permit it, which again is very different from having it blocked or disabled altogether. So when looking at your TLS configurations, it's not just a case of making sure that TLS 1.3 and AES are preferred, but the legacy ones are absolutely disabled. It's interesting looking at certificate health, because the order in which certificates are returned is important, as is whether the root certificate is included in that initial handshake. Again, there's actually a very strict way in which this stuff should happen. There's a correct order in terms of where the lead certificate or the server certificate should be sent back, the intermediary certificates, and so on. Now, the root certificate shouldn't be included in that, and the correct order should be observed. So in a lot of cases, the correct order isn't observed, and a lot of servers are actually sending back root certificates when not necessary. Now, worst case scenario, that's wasting bandwidth. It's just an unnecessary amount of data that's being transferred between client and server. In some unusual cases, you will find some clients maybe don't accept the connection because the certificate order has been returned incorrectly as well. How am I doing for time? I won't linger too much. So I spent an awful lot of time looking at phishing and malware sites as well. And there was an awful lot of noise made over the past few years around, excuse me, around extended validation certificates, which are the very expensive certificates that give you the nice kind of green, the green writing, the padlock, as you can see in the browser here. Now, although that special demarcation is being deprecated now by major browsers, you have to go hunting for it. What was interesting is that one of the main cases for EV certs was that they would reduce the amount of phishing and fraud sites that that we're using because of the expense of them, because of the extra validation that went into or providing that certificate. But when looking at just under 1 million, I think it was 800,000 phishing sites and malware sites. Actually, an awful lot of them were using OV and EV certificates, and that wasn't necessarily because those EV certs were being generated and supplied to threat actors or phishers, but because the attackers were using known services that had EV certificates. So blogging sites like Blogspot or URL shorteners like bit.ly or secureserver.net. Anything that was being sent or redirected from those servers inherently had an EV cert, so also looked, more secure potentially. Anyway, I think we are seeing as an industry those certificates being deprecated, largely because the browsers are kind of forcing their deprecation. One thing to be aware of, this, I'm not sure this slide is really kind of showing it properly. We're seeing an awful lot of phishing sites being accessed a very few number of times. So obviously, automation's going, automation is working, or rather, automation is important for attackers. It's no point in spending hours, days building up servers for them to be accessed once or twice. They want to deploy things using some kind of script or automation because they know it's going to be torn down and then built back up again. So we are seeing around 95% of phishing sites access 10 times or less. The vast majority of phishing sites now, almost 80%, are using encryption. An awful lot of them are using randomly generated subdomains. And I don't think I've got a slide for it here, but one thing I found really interesting was some of them are using URLs that are so long that they push the real base domain, off the end of the address bar, which I think is quite a nice trick, because they will start the URL with something that looks secure, such as ssl.secure.login.bank, and then a randomly generated subdomain, which then pushes the subdomain of, the base domain of attacker.org, way out of view of the address bar. So speaking around kind of automation, what you're seeing here, so the blue bars represent the Alexa top 1 million. The red bars represent all the phishing sites. Again, almost 1 million. It was just over 800,000 sites which I connected to. And I have to admit, I was expecting Let's Encrypt to be at the very top of the list in terms of the CAs that generated those certificates, because of the automation involved in Let's Encrypt, because of the fact that they're free certificates. And they are up there, but they're certainly not the kind of the number one. Actually, the number 1 and 2 spot really are the same provider. It's Komodo, and specifically cPanel, the kind of web admin interface, which allows you to deploy a web server and then automatically generate a Komodo certificate and embed it into it, is by far the kind of leading provider of certificates for malicious and phishing sites. I've kind of briefly mentioned at the top that we've now got other protocols which are, helping to shore up or close some of the gaps that TLS kind of leaves a little bit open. Again, I won't have time to spend too long on it now, but one of the problems and benefits of the current certificate authority or the public key infrastructure is that any CA can generate a certificate for any domain. That's great. Obviously, it allows, a bit of competition. You can go to the best CA that provides the best service or the best price. But of course, what it means is if any one of those, if any of the hundreds and hundreds of CAs that we have across the world is compromised or can be defrauded and tricked into producing a certificate for a domain that the attacker doesn't own, our browsers and clients will accept it, regardless. And there are some ways in which we can kind of mitigate this. Some apps now perform some kind of certificate pinning. But one of the ways we can help mitigate that risk is by using DNS certificate authorization records. So what these allow you to do, as you can see in the example, is you can have multiple CAA DNS records which specify which CAs, that's a lot of acronyms, which certificate authorities are allowed to produce certificates on your behalf. So this example is showing you that Let's Encrypt only is allowed to produce certificates for example.org. What we're seeing is, well, you can see there in the scans of the top 1 million, only 1.9% of sites were making use of those. That could, and I would say should be, an awful lot higher. I wouldn't say there's really any need to let any single CA in the world generate certificates for your website. But in the scans, it's also curious to see, I was seeing an awful lot of typos. So people are manually configuring these DNS CAA records and they might have, they might miss the T off for Let's Encrypt.org. Well, if that's not the exact format it needs to be for Let's Encrypt, that will fail, and Let's Encrypt will try and generate a certificate for you, and then it will fail because the DNS CAA record isn't correct. HSTS are, one of the other things we can use to help shore up TLS. So HSTS, for those that don't know, is a trust on first use protocol. So the very first time I connect to google.com, my browser, or rather the web server, will send back a header, an HSTS header, which informs my browser to only ever load google.com over an SSL or TLS connection again. So it's very, very useful, particularly if a site is fully encrypted end to end. In fact, I need to update that stat on the left. I've updated the graph and not the stats. So in the latest kind of round of scans I've done just a few days ago, the numbers jumped from 15% last year to around about 17.8% this year. So the number's creeping up. But again, really, once we come to a fully encrypted web, there's no real reason that not every website should be using this header. Right, how am I doing for time? Doing okay, I think. So why do we use HSTS? One of the reasons is to make sure that our pages are being loaded over a secure connection when possible. But I would say one of the more relevant reasons is that it actually prevents users from bypassing warnings. It's all too easy. In fact, we've seen examples just over the past 12 to 18 months where large organizations, and I'm thinking of some large US government bodies, have told users to ignore certificate warnings because they maybe had a certificates expire or some other kind of what they perceive to be minor problem. But of course, what this is doing, if we're teaching the user to bypass warnings, to click on advanced and click on ignore certificate warning, is we're teaching them to ignore the security warnings that we're giving to them, that are there to design to warn them that there's a problem. So one of the benefits of HSTS, it's a risk, but one of the benefits is that it can actually block these kind of user bypasses. So going back to the Kazakhstan example, if one of the Kazakhstan citizens hadn't installed a certificate and they tried to go to google.com, they would have received a certificate warning. Now, if they click on advanced and click through to the relevant sites, yes, they would have ignored the warning. They might have a little yellow exclamation mark in the browser, but what they maybe don't know is that now all their connections are still being intercepted. Like they haven't prevented any kind of man-in-the-middle interception happening there. So again, HSTS can be tricky. Again, I saw lots of misconfigurations in all the scans I did where developers or app owners have maybe not quite put the right headers in, and that does run the risk of actually locking users out because there's a timeout warning for this, or timeout value for HSTS. You can potentially, if you get it wrong, lock your users out of your site until that timeout expires. So it's important to get it right. And I would say probably worthwhile having some kind of centralized device or policy that applies, scrubs whatever setting is being embedded by the app, and then deploys the correct one at the perimeter before that header, before the traffic goes, gets sent back to the user. Nathan kind of briefly mentioned, we're not seeing tons of known examples, but I suspect there are many examples or many instances that are going unspotted, is the use of encrypted protocols by malware. And this is, exactly the point I mentioned before, where if we're not intercepting traffic that our staff members, or, our users are browsing out to the web, if we can't intercept it, they could potentially be bringing back in malware or leaking data. In this example, the name escapes me. Yeah, Godlua, I believe this was. Two examples from a couple of years ago, Godlua and PSI Xbot were a couple of malware strains, which once the initial payload got onto the device, it's first trying to communicate back to GitHub over HTTPS to get the address of its command and control server to get further instructions. If HTTPS to GitHub was blocked or was intercepted, it would then try a DNS over HTTPS connection. And that's the example you can see in the screenshots below, where, and this is what's really curious about DNS over HTTPS, is that it really does look like any other standard HTTPS request. So even if you are kind of decrypting and intercepting standard HTTPS connections, unless you have something that knows to look for DNS over HTTPS queries, you might still be allowing those connections out. Excuse me, in this case, the malware made a connection out to c.cloudappconfig.com, got the response back of the IP address you can see, and that was the address of its command and control server that it was able to then communicate with, get further instructions, and then send stolen data back to. And then just finally, in terms of stats, our actual vulnerabilities, I would argue that in most cases the biggest risk to HTTPS configurations are misconfigurations and badly configured deployments. But we do have occasionally problems with the protocols themselves or specific implementations of protocols by certain vendors or SSL software libraries. Robot is one of the biggest ones to have hit us over recent years. Now, the scans I did for this were only on the top 100,000. It takes a significantly longer time to test for Robot. So, I was kind of maxing out at 100,000 in terms of just getting some data back to work with. But I was still seeing around 0.5%, so 0.5%, which is a small number. But if you consider this is 0.5% of the most, 100,000 most popular sites in the entire world, it's, perhaps a shame it's not a slightly smaller number. So again, one of the main ways you can stop being vulnerable to Robot is disable RSA handshakes altogether, as I mentioned before. So it's enough kind of slides and numbers for now. We're going to, or I'm going to talk about Kryptonized. So as I said, in wanting to perform these kind of scans, there were loads of tools available, on the web, some, command line tools and other scriptable tools that allow us to scan for HTTPS configurations, but they all had some kind of problem. They either weren't scanning for TLS 1.3, or we couldn't scan enough sites, or at a quick enough pace. So what we did is we built an app, a freely available app now. It's on GitHub called, which we've called Kryptonized. And the point of Kryptonized is that it will perform many similar tasks to scanners that are out there on the web, and hopefully some new additional scans as well. So it's going to go connect to your web server and test for what you might expect, the versions of TLS protocols and ciphers that it supports. It's going to check for those TLS certificates to make sure they're in date, to make sure that they're valid, to make sure they're signed by a trusted, third-party certificate authority. But it's also going to go and check for application headers and cookies. So things like HSTS, things like HTTP public key pinning, to make sure that cookies have maybe got the secure flag set so that they're only being sent over an HTTPS connection. It will check for things like HTTP to HTTPS redirects. You might want to check to see whether there's a kind of manual redirection happening, whether HSTS is coming into effect. So that's another element of the report that we flag. We'll check on the DNS CAA records to see if they've been configured correctly or configured at all. And we'll also provide some warnings and suggestions as well, so that if you're maybe not a TLS or HTTPS expert, we'll give you some guidance in terms of, maybe you want to turn off TLS 1.0, maybe your certificate's expiring in less than 30 days, for example. And then we start to add more and more bits and pieces to it as well. Now, we haven't got an SSL Labs scoring component yet. We're thinking of ways of providing that similar kind of high level insight in terms of the health of the configuration. We have got server components being listed. We've now got things like TLS fingerprinting happening. So one of the things that's very useful is you have a deployment of maybe dozens or even hundreds of TLS configurations all over the world. You might want to perform some TLS fingerprinting to make sure that, very quickly they're all configured in the same way. So what is Kryptonized? Kryptonized is a Python developed script. It relies heavily on a fantastic open source tool called SSLIs, which is also developed in Python as well. So SSLIs is a great tool we've kind of built on top of, and then developed other modules and utilities as well. So it's available as source. You can go and download the source, create your own scripts. It works and is functioning on all kind of major operating systems. We do have a Windows executable, although it is, I think, slightly old actually. We probably could do with producing a new executable. And we've also got Docker containers as well. So for those that don't even want to go and install the Python library using pip install, which is super simple, but for those that don't, you can just download the Docker container and have a go with that instead. Now, as Nathan said, I've been praying all day long to the demo gods. They weren't listening for a very long time, but I think they're playing ball. So hopefully we can give you a very quick kind of demo in terms of what Kryptonized is. Now, if I can remember what I'm doing. So As I said, so Kryptonite is developed as a Python library. So what we have as, as I said, you can just go and clone the, where's our sample script? You can go and clone the GitHub source. This is the sample code we've got in there for you. So we've gone and developed our own. So for the kind of mass top 1 million scanning that we do, we have a slightly more complex version of this, but this will kind of get you started. All this script is doing is essentially reading in the kind of job options, if you like, the job parameters from this JSON file, and then calling the main function of scanner. So either at the command line or in this JSON file, you can then define what jobs are being done. So you can tell it what port you want scanning, excuse me, whether you want to go and check for DNS CA records, check all the HTTP configurations, HTTP2, TLS, the fingerprinting, and so on. You can get it to kind of bring in, like import or read the HTML, the actual body, if you like. And then there are options as to whether you want to print the output to the console, whether you only want it generating JSON. And then finally, you've actually got a list of targets, which again, being JSON, just comma separated value, you can put in any number of web servers in there that you want to. So just running, if we would just run this simple script, then what are we going to do? We're going to run. So we're going to run the sample script with the sample job. Again, it's all been pre-configured. So in that JSON, we've got port configured of 443. We've got the test, the site we're going to test of www.f5.com. Perform some basic checks, performs DNS resolution, checks to see whether the port is open. And then all the kind of other various checks. Now, this is just the kind of console output, which has been simplified somewhat. So it's going to give you the basic information in terms of what protocol and cipher was ultimately selected to do, perform the actual encryption. It will then list what other protocols are supported. It's going to give you the TLS fingerprint, and then some information about the certificates as well, and things like DNS CA records. As you can see at the bottom, we've got some basic recommendations as well in terms of, just first steps you can do. And these are things we want to kind of add, add as we kind of continue to develop Kryptonized as well. So if you don't want to do that, let's go and deploy the Kryptonized library. So if we're going to make a directory, crypto test, let's go and cd into crypto test. So I'm just going to spin up a virtual environment, so I don't have any kind of dependencies overwriting each other or getting in the way. And then it's as simple as pip install Kryptonite. Hopefully that will install correctly, and then I can just issue the command of Kryptonite, and then maybe I can give it a different domain. I can maybe go to github.com and then issue the kind of scan. I'm going to figure out my own parameters now. I think it scans TLS listed, TLS, and HTTP. In the kind of documentation and in the JSON file, we do kind of document which TLS tests we do, because there are some vulnerability tests that we can do, testing for things like robots. There are some more kind of, I wouldn't say intrusive, but certainly some tests that kind of take a bit longer to perform. So actually some of those tests, mainly the vulnerability tests, are being disabled by default. So you can go into the JSON or use the command line parameters to actually specify those and perform robot tests, if you want to. The other option, as I said, is to just get the Docker container. So it's as simple as Docker pull, F5 labs, and then Kryptonite. This will just take a moment to download. So what I will do in the meantime, actually, is just go and take a look at the JSON. So as in when you run the command line, assume the command line options are there, or the kind of JSON options are there, as well as producing output to the console, it will go and output to a JSON file as well. And this is when it starts becoming, a lot more useful in things like CI/CD environments, or some kind of automation where you may be deploying code on a regular basis, and you want to use the kind of constant checking of Kryptonite to feed back into some kind of portal, maybe. So just to kind of format this in a slightly prettier way, This is essentially the kind of full output of Kryptonite, using the scan options that we did. So we get a collection of all the headers, we get to see some of the cookies that are used, which ones are being transmitted over a secure connection, and then all the results of the actual TLS scan as well, including certificate information and so on. Right, so Docker has finished pulling that down. So to run it, we're going to do Docker run. Is it double dash, I think, RM, and then interactive. And again, you can pass the same kind of command line options through to Kryptonite in Docker as you would do at the command line. It's fairly new. We're looking at kind of improving the way that that the Docker container is built. I kind of cheated at the moment, honestly. The Docker file essentially just installs one of the dependencies and installs the Kryptonite library using pip. It does work on most operating systems. I think we have the odd one that doesn't want to play ball, but as I said, I'm looking to improve that anyway. So that's it. It's very kind of simple to use. We hope it's kind of useful. I think one of the things that isn't maybe obvious when you first look at it, let me go back to my slides, is that there are other ways of doing these kind of checks. For those that have maybe had an interest in checking the health of their services, there are some really, really great sites out there, including SSL Labs and Hardenized that do these kind of checks for you. And for a lot of people, that's probably still the right way. In fact, many of those, especially Hardenized, will go into a lot more depth than we currently do with Kryptonite. So we are looking to add more features. The one and main differentiator I would say with Kryptonite at the moment is that because it's installable, because you run it locally, you can test internal and development sites, as well as test, dozens or hundreds of external sites, should you want to. On top of that, because you're getting the kind of JSON output, or because you're using it programmatically in your own Python scripts, you can then either take the JSON output or take the JSON, the values that return from the functions, and use them in your own kind of pipelines or your own scripts. So this is a very kind of simple mock-up I did a while ago, whereby the JSON results are just being brought into a simple command dashboard to kind of, so we can keep an eye on the health of various web servers that we have deployed. So that's it from me. I have some general recommendations in terms of TLS best practice. The number one thing I would sum it up with by saying is just making sure you keep an eye on your TLS configuration. Don't set and forget and leave it to kind of rot. Make sure you're kind of removing those legacy protocols and ciphers. But really the main ask is give Kryptonite a go. It's pretty new. There was a team of 2, there's now a team of 1 developing it. So I don't always get all the time I want to work on it, but it's open, it's on GitHub. We kind of encourage anyone to go and, to have a play, to submit bugs, to submit pull requests for any kind of improvements and recommendations. Otherwise, join us on f5labs.com and, just let me know any and all feedback, good or bad. So that's it from me, Nathan.
That's great, Dave. I've got a quick question, actually. Well, an observation more than anything. Even early today, I was speaking to I was emailing a customer about their lack of HSTS and actually their lack of the developer understanding of HSTS. You really misunderstood what that was there for. And even back in a few years ago, I know we were talking about what I used to do a few years ago. I found it really difficult to get customers of mine to move forward with TLS as the older version was deprecated. There seemed to be more of a worry about supporting older OSs, really old OSs, exactly. What impact might be, than making the rest of their user base more secure. And it sounds like that challenge, actually, from your stats, actually, that might be better now than it was, say, I don't know, 3 years ago, perhaps, when I was...
I mean, honestly, I think that the biggest kind of improvements haven't necessarily been from companies kind of deprecating older protocols themselves. I mean, some of the bigger players will do, but we tend to do stuff that we have to do. We get forced. So it's, as I said, it's the likes of Chrome and Firefox that are forcing our hand. They're deprecating the protocols in the browsers. So we no longer have a choice to use TLS 1.0 and 1.1. But you're right. I mean, like anything in security, it's always going to be a kind of a trade-off, risk, cost, usability kind of, trade-off. But I would say, my experience is that TLS is one of the better misunderstood protocols and kind of tools that we have out there. Again, most people kind of see TLS as you whack a certificate on a web server and you're done. There's not often that much thought that goes into the kind of certificates and the kind of protocols, and especially disabling the older ones, using headers or DNS records to kind of shore up those things. So yeah, we don't see much being moved, to be honest with you, unless our hand is being forced a little bit.
I see that in the chat I've got Adam's hand up. Adam, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
One thing that I've noticed on a few servers is specifically mail servers where older algorithms or either deprecated algorithms, cipher suites, or actual older deprecated protocols of TLS or SSL are enabled. Does Kryptonite also enable the ability to scan SMTPS servers and mail records, or is it just websites? I'm
really glad you asked. That's imminent. So no is a short answer, but very soon, because that's exactly to your point, that's a huge area of interest for me, because Drown is one of the perfect examples of how other servers, such as web servers, can then affect the security of web servers. So no, not yet, but we're going to enable Start, TLS, and SMTPS kind of checks in a version soon, hopefully. No ETA, unfortunately, but hopefully in the next few weeks or months.
Thanks, Adam, for that. Thank you. No more questions in the chat, but you've fascinating stuff, Dave, as always. Really appreciate the updates on where TLS is nowadays, personally as well as professional. So thanks for that, Dave. And we'll keep an eye. Any questions come in?
Yeah, of course. I'll be hanging around for a while. And you know what? The one thing I have heard is from quite a few customers with this report and these kind of stats is they don't always generate a lot of questions, but they can be quite useful to take to a board or to a management team to kind of show why we need to start disabling other protocols and so on. So, but yeah, I'll be around for a while. Any other questions that come up, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah. I've got an evil question, David.
Oh, how dare you!
It causes a lot of debate, right? And I don't think there's actually a right answer to it. But what layer of the OSI stack is TLS?
Jim, I can't believe you're asking me that. I'm going to say, is it 5 or 6? It's 5, isn't it?
I think, yeah. It's what it does is so strange. I think you could even argue it's a layer 7 protocol.
Well,
but technically, yeah, absolutely, it's a layer 5.
Yeah, no, I think exactly to your point. You know, especially when we're incorporating other, I mean, specifically like layer 7. I couldn't call it a protocol, but layer 7 aspects like app headers like HSTS and HPKP, like other protocols we're bringing in like DNS. I mean, it's way like, you know, it's clearly more than just a standalone layer 5 protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thanks for shining the light on it. It's a really important topic.
Yeah, thank you.
Great stuff. Okay, guys. Well, great timing, Dave. So well done on the demo coming through and the preso. Should we take just 5 minutes, 5 or so minutes, just to grab a drink, refresh ourselves, and then come back? And Jim, I'll make you co-host, and we can get you going. Great stuff. Okay, see you all in 5 minutes.
Is that any good? Can you see some trundling?
I can, yes.
Cool. Well, off I go, I suppose.
Yeah, kick off.
All right. So, I'm Jim. I'm one of the chapter leaders with Nate, and I've been threatening to do a talk on threat modeling at OWASP for 2 years now, and so here we are, really. So yeah, I mean, threat modeling is a bit of a dark art, really, and I just picked this tweet out from Dan Kaminsky. He's a decent follow on Twitter, actually. InfoSec person. Grumble. What's your threat model? And I think often when we're talking about whether a system's secure or not, or whether we need to put more controls in place, or whether we need to improve it, the question comes up: what's your threat model? But what does it mean, really? I suppose that's the challenge. It can feel a little bit alienating, I think, to a newcomer, that you've got to go off and work out a threat model. And what is a threat model? So that's the elevator pitch for this talk, really, is getting started with threat modeling, and a bit of that is understanding what a threat model is. I would say at the outset, there's no one way of threat modeling. There's no single, unified, sort of process to follow. So everyone will have their own process. And if people have got their own insights and ways of doing it, I'd be really interested to hear those. Because it's not going to be a terribly long talk, to be honest. So yeah, be really interested to hear those insights at the end. Right, standard stuff. Who am I? I'm Jim. Obviously, I'm one of the chapter leaders. In my day job, I'm a consultant. So my background is kind of like software developer, and then in about 2009-10, I was like got involved in the whole DevOps thing. Automation of infrastructure. Code approaches to infrastructure, and then I've been doing security for about 5-6 years now. So I've come on that, but I started off as a developer, and my role is I'm a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks, which is a software consultancy. So software development is really my focus, but with a bit of a security flavour, really. That's me. Yeah. So I suppose just to motivate it a little bit. I mean, threat modelling is taking a risk-based approach to the security requirements for whatever system you're working on, whether it be a website or whether it's a blog or, whether it's a full-blown enterprise resource management. It's about taking a risk-based approach to working out what those requirements are. And it's kind of complicated, really. I mean, risk is a complicated thing because it's about predicting the future, right? It's about saying what could happen that's bad and how do we stop it? It's not a simple question, right? It's not the same as like how big should the checkout button be to make the customer click on it. It's a bit more complicated. You've got to think about what are the sources of threats out there in the world. Is it cyber criminals or is it nation states? Are you worried about compliance stuff, right? I mean, are you worried about GDPR, or that one of your customers will actually put in a complaint and ask for all of their data or challenge the way you're processing their data? There's some of these curveball attacks, like you sort of wiper worms and that kind of thing, or there's like insider threats. There's all these different sources of threat. You then need to think about your assets, like what are you protecting? Like, if you're a bank, then you're going to be protecting money, right? If you're the government, you're probably going to be protecting all kinds of personal data. But what are you actually protecting? What's your business protecting? Is it sensitive data? A lot of organizations actually care a lot about their reputation. If you think about some of the breaches, it can have more of an impact on, if your customers are going to stop buying from you, then maybe that's a bigger impact than losing the data. Compliance, supporting business objectives. There's all these kind of impacts. And then you need to think as well about the actual system that you're running, right? I mean, the security requirements for like protecting like a Java app that's on premise are going to be completely different to like the security questions about running like Lambdas that are running in AWS. For example, it's good. So there's going to be something about your particular technology stack, your architecture, how your developers work, particularly. So anyway, risk is just this huge topic, right? And for most software developers, the main priority is just to deliver the story, get it over the line, and where do you even start? And so that's where I want to start this talk, because I suggest just start with what you're doing right now, whatever you're doing this sprint. Take a look at the story that you're working on in the next 2 weeks and sort of begin from there. So that's the approach I'm going to take, is just to say, okay, well, forget all of that detail. We can layer that on later. We just want to get started. So we'll take a case study, right? So we've got, let's imagine that we're a software dev team and we're working for supermarket, LD, Tesco, whoever. And there's like an online portal. for people to order shopping. And there's a user story that as part of the website, customers need a page where they can see their details. You know, you can check that your address is right, and you can check that your preferences are set appropriately around marketing and where you want your stuff delivered and all the rest of it. So that story's in the backlog. So just, you know, and you know, it might be a completely different context that you're working in, but just take whatever you're working on and kind of begin there. Really, that's the message. So how do we threat model that? How do we derive security requirements from any bit of scope or context that we're working on in that particular sprint? So if there's one takeaway from listening to me blathering on, it's these three questions, right? So first question, second question, third question. And you can apply these questions in pretty much any context, and you can come up with some sensible answers, if that makes sense. So it's a tool to help thinking about what the threat model of any bit of scope is. Question number one: what are you actually building? What are you actually going to create? You know, get clear on that, because that's going to have an impact on the threat model. Question number two: what can go wrong in this context? You know, and this will take the form of a brainstorm. You know, and it can be quite helpful to get a number of different perspectives into that brainstorm. And so I tend to recommend that brainstorm is done collaboratively. But what can actually go wrong? You know, what is predicting the future, right? So brainstorming is a really good way to get into it. You know, nobody's written the list. You can't just Google it. You know, okay, well. So brainstorming is a good way into that, but what can actually go wrong? And then once you've identified, you know, the things that can go wrong, and particularly once you've identified the most risky things that could go wrong, what are you going to do about it? So if you forget everything else that I've said, which would be completely fair enough, just remember that structure. What are you building? What can go wrong? What are you going to do about it? And next time you think, okay, well, what are the security implications of this? Just go through those three steps, and you know, I believe that you'll get good results doing that. I really do think threat modeling is that simple. All right, what's this slide? Yeah, I mean, so step one is just kind of like draw a picture of what you're doing, and we're all quite familiar with this in the technology industry. We've come across some kind of picture, boxes and lines. People often ask me what are the particular rules for drawing a diagram for threat modeling, and I think there's only one, which is you need arrows to show how the data flows. So typically where are the data flows originating from and where they're going to, and that's kind of a complicated way of saying where the arrows of the data flows in your system. I think as long as you've got that, I mean, you could do like a UML sequence diagram, you know, which is the kind of thing that folks tend to learn at, you know, university courses on software engineering. You can just do a very basic drawing, do you know what I mean, that you would just use as part of your regular sprint planning to get on the same page with the other developers on the team. So don't worry about it. Just kind of draw a picture, I suppose. Yeah, okay, so this is the next slide. Like Nath actually mentioned like how do you do it? I mean, actually, if you look at this picture, you actually see Nath there. Look, Nath, there's you.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you, Jim.
That was a few years ago now, wasn't it?
That's in better hair days, though.
Oh God, don't even start. You'll get me feeling paranoid. But you know, in other times, getting around a whiteboard is a great way of doing that. You know, you can do it remotely as well, is the point that I'm trying to make here. So I just wanted to give a quick example of it, really. So, you know, going back to that use case of the customer, supermarket customer, they want to update their details. Okay, that's wrong. So that should be details database, let's say, or let's be modern about it. This is a microservice. You know, maybe you've got some microservice that keeps all of your customers' data. you've got some like intermediate service that's maybe an AWS Lambda. You know, this is the kind of thing, if you had a new dev on the team, you'd just be like, okay, I'm just going to draw you a picture and I'll explain how the system works so that you can, you know, you can contribute stories. Obviously, like the UI, I would imagine would be like some JavaScript app that's running in the browser. And then the thing is kind of, you know, you're going to need some kind of authentication. So maybe it's some identity provider, you know, and I think get together as a group is a great way to just uncover any assumptions that might sit kind of within of unpacking how the system works. So, you know, kind of draw it together. I mean, this isn't a tool that ThoughtWorks uses called Mural. I mean, you could use like Google Slides, or you could use like Microsoft Teams or Jamboard or whatever. You know, you just draw a picture, you know, sort of share it and just say, okay, is this how the system works? Something that I think is quite important is just to say how the data flows, as I mentioned. So like here, the supermarket customer is like going to the customer profile UI website, and then that's making an authentication request to the identity provider, which returns some data. And you can argue that's sort of multi-directional, but like actually draw the lines from where the request originates from, if that makes sense. So it originates from the customer here, and then it originates from the browser, and then the Lambda actually makes a request to the microservice. So just draw those lines in, because they really help when you actually start the next step, which is sort of brainstorming what could go wrong. Yeah, and just don't worry if it's not perfect, right? Just draw a picture with some data flows. It really is that simple. Okay, so the next step, once you've got a picture, and you can spend a bit of time on that. I tend to think, you know, actually spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes with a group of you just getting on the same page about what you're doing is a reasonable amount of time to spend, you know, just so you're all completely on the same page and there's a shared understanding. But the next step is to start to brainstorm what could go wrong. Yeah, and I mean, I've sort of explained the system. Does anyone want to shout out, like, think of something, you know, what could go wrong? See whether anyone does. Oh, I'm going to give you some hints, and then I am going to require some kind of audience participation. So it's really easy to start spotting where there could be particular vulnerabilities in a system like this, and you do it by following the data. So the way that I do it is I think, okay, which bit of this do I trust the least? And probably the customer who's just going to be on the internet, probably trust them the least, at least to begin with. So the customer's coming into the UI, and this is where we can start to apply quite a useful framework, which is called Stride. So Stride, if you haven't come across it, is 6 different. They're basically just like ideas to sort of help brainstorm ways that you could break, or that an attacker could break any particular, you know, data flow. So for example, let's start off with spoofed identity. Like, spoofed identity is going to be about authentication. You see that I've got the key concepts down here are sort of identity and authentication. So let's start with that. You know, we've got this first arrow from the supermarket customer to the customer profile UI. What vulnerabilities could there be in authentication? You know, and so, you know, straight away you might think, okay, well, I'll just do a bit of copy paste here. You know, maybe there'll be a brute force on the password, you know, then I tackle the brute force password. And then someone else might say, oh, well.
Cookie theft, Jim?
What's that?
Steal someone's cookies via an XSS exploit?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, you could have sort of like a browser hijack, right? You could have
password spray. Password spray.
Yeah, that's a good one. So there could be a sort of password spraying attack.
An injection attack.
This surely we've learned already this evening that there must be some sort of TLS-based threat man in the middle.
I was waiting for someone to say that. I'm glad you jumped in there, Nathan.
Yeah, so there could be like, you know, sort of weak TLS because, you know, obviously people haven't used Dave's tool to identify those weak ciphers. So you can see it's really easy, right? And straight away we started to sort of focus on authentication, but also go a bit broader because, you know, it's not about classifying the threats or the ideas. It's just about throwing them out there, right? It's just about brainstorming. And you see that tension that when we started, it was like kind of like, oh, I don't know what to say. And then as soon as the ball starts rolling, it's really obvious how to do it.
Jim, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So I mentioned TLS myself there, but and obviously we don't know the full audience on tonight, what all their skills are. But I imagine a lot of us are security focused. But when for developers who perhaps don't have that security focus, I often think that the first and only thing that is ever mentioned is TLS, because it is, you know, people even outside of, say, security will understand about TLS. So my question earlier on was going to be, how do you stop every threat being TLS related, because it's so easy? But B, you know, what techniques could developers use that perhaps don't know about, cookies, for example?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points I'd make on that. I mean, the first one is whatever group of people you get together to do the threat modeling, you're never going to get anywhere if you just sort of brainstorm 1 or 2 things. Like, just be ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? Just get as many post-its up on here, you know, and here, like, you know, with this moral software, if everyone was logged in, everyone could be typing their own thing in, because if, you know, you're only going to end up, you're going to have less than 100, right? But the more different ideas you can get, rather than getting fixated on one vulnerability, the better it's going to be, right? If you just come out of it with the OWASP top 10, you might as well just do the OWASP top 10, right? It's getting into the other point that I'd make is, I think it's really useful to get people from different specialties in. I mean, I'm quite lucky, but I mean, I suppose I don't know how unusual I am, but because I've gone from a dev to a security in my career, I know a little bit. I know enough about both to be dangerous, if you know what I mean. But actually, you can't know everything. I mean, you know, nobody knows everything about everything. So, getting somebody, if you're a dev team with not a lot of security knowledge, get someone from the security team in, get someone from infrastructure in, and just bring all those perspectives. Really, that's my answer to that. Cool. So, I mean, that was just based off spoofed identity, but I just want to do a brief, you know, kind of run through stride. So spoofed identity, obviously the dog here is pretending to be a human being, which you do have to watch out for. Cats are worse for it. But it's just the notion that, you know, authentication can be broken, and there's a number of different ways to do it, essentially. So tampering with input, this is like your injection, where you've got like a lack of validation. So, you know, somebody puts in their, you know, Bobby drop tables name, or they send an XML packet that's got a malware in it. You know, all kinds of malware injection is tampering with input. So that's really just a cue to think about, well, what if somebody used a legitimate interface to inject something that was problematic? Yeah, repudiation of action. Does anyone want to define repudiation? No, it's a funny word. It is a strange word. So repudiation.
Repudiation would be the ability to deny the action took place from an individual, because non-repudiation is the ability to pinpoint the action to an individual, such as when we use signed certificates.
That's a great definition, actually. This is a really interesting idea, I think, for security, because there's this whole, like, we often focus in software development on, like, and equally in infrastructure, on protecting the system, but it's also important that we're able to detect and respond if there is an issue. And detection and response is much better if we can hold someone accountable for their actions, essentially. So like say if somebody, I don't know, say somebody's got access to a database, medical database, and they're looking at like footballers to see whether they've had, you know, an STD or something to tell the papers. If it's actually in the system that you're logging that people are running those searches, and you find out that there has been a data breach, you can hold that person accountable. And that has like a second order effect as well that's quite useful, which is that if you tell people that you're logging the data and you're auditing the data, then that actually acts as a deterrent from people abusing the system. So, I mean, that's not the only application of repudiation, right? But repudiation is just this really interesting security property. And what I tend to encourage teams do when they think about repudiation is like, I don't know, let's have a look at this line here, for example, which is the data flow from the Lambda across to the microservice. Well, like, let's say that we suddenly detected that somebody had requested every single customer in the database. And actually, we said to ourselves, well, we can't see any record of that in the AWS Lambda. What was the origin of those requests? You know, maybe there was like a sort of, you know, there was like a malicious Lambda that had been injected into the system somehow. I've spelled malicious wrong, but that's fine. Actually, if that details microservice had kept a log of where all the requests were coming from, you would then be able to investigate it. And it's a bit of a silly example, but I think repudiation is often a really good opportunity to think about logging, because logging is kind of this great way, it's great security control that when actually something does go wrong, you can actually go off and investigate it. Yeah, so logging audit is part of repudiation. Information disclosure, obviously, David gave us a masterclass earlier on some of the aspects of TLS that are important to think about, and some of the controls such as HSTS and others that we can apply. But yeah, I mean, information disclosure typically in web systems, it's about having that secure encryption, making sure that confidentiality is maintained, that you're not vulnerable to man in the middle, that your sort of certificate signing is correct, you know, or anything else related to, like, you know, maybe you're not encrypting the data at rest, you know, or maybe maybe you've got an API on the internet that is not authenticated, right? I mean, that's pretty serious, you know. So it's brainstorming that kind of thing. How are we doing time? Yeah, denial of service, exactly what it says on the tin. You know, somebody basically making the system unavailable by just hammering it with loads of traffic. Yeah, escalation of privilege. Escalation of privilege is more around, so I often think, like, Nate, to your point about developers, like, developers often are not focused enough on security to even sometimes perceive the difference between authentication, which is like, how difficult is it to log into a system, versus like authorization, which is like, once I'm logged in, how do I ensure that that person can only see the parts of the system they should be able to? Like, how do I make sure that, like, a new starter can't log into my GitHub account and just delete all the code that the organization's ever written, right? That's escalation of privilege. Escalation of privilege is about authorization. So this is just a great time to start to think about, like, maybe it's less like application authorization, like, are the users locked down so they can only see the data or take the actions that they need to do for their job role? Or it could be about, you know, network authorization, you know, sort of like security groups in AWS or sort of VNet roles in Azure. But how do we make sure that, like, these servers are, like, not connected to the internet, and so you know, are not exposed to, you know, wherever, you know, whoever's kind of going to attack it. So Stride's kind of useful because, like, there's not just one different security threat even in the smallest possible story you're doing. You need to consider a bunch of different perspectives, and Stride helps you do that, essentially. It's kind of useful for that. Yeah, and you can do it remotely. You just use Mural or some service like that, just get people throwing ideas out there. And you should end up with a picture of what you're drawing with basically a laundry list of things that could go wrong. Yeah, so my scroll wheel goes the wrong way. Yeah, I mean, so, I kind of said earlier, get like, what if you ended up with 100 different things that could go wrong? Obviously, you're not going to be able to drop everything and fix all 100 issues. I would argue in any environment, there's always going to be pressure on software development teams to deliver features, and there's never going to be time to fix absolutely every security vulnerability. So what you need to do next is you need to say, okay, we've worked out what we're building, we've worked out what could go wrong. We need to do a bit of prioritization, and because it's security, the prioritization should be based on risk. So it should be based on what is the likelihood and what is the impact if this thing actually kind of happens. And there's a bunch of really technical ways that you can do a risk assessment. You can actually do a risk evaluation and go through all of these different vulnerabilities that you've identified and work out which is the most important. But the one that I find works best, particularly in dev teams, is just to kind of vote on it. Just to say, okay, everyone gets 4 votes or something like that. So we've got a voting thing here, right? I don't know. Yeah, begin voting. And then people can just go, okay, well, actually, I think that one's important, or well, actually, that one. And just spend a few minutes, and pretty simple, but it's just getting a consensus view on what is the most important. And then what I tend to do, I mean, it depends on how often, but pick out between sort of 5 and 3 top ones and say, okay, those are the ones that we're actually going to address. So in this example, it might be let's say the lack of 2-factor authentication was the thing that we're going to address, right? Because actually we think we should have 2-factor authentication around this service, and it's pretty risky. So you pick that out, and then the last step is just to put some extra scope in your backlog to fix the issue, right? What are you going to do about it? And that's essentially got to be scope in your backlog. Now that scope, if you work in an agile environment, it might be extra acceptance criteria on the existing story that you began with. If it's a small thing, could be a new story. You could have a new story, so it could be a new epic, even say like implement 2-factor authentication. Or maybe that's a story for a different team, right? And so it's a conversation with whoever manages the product to say, look, we've had a threat modeling session. We really think we need 2-factor authentication. Can we get an epic on the backlog? That kind of thing. Sometimes it might be a spike. It might be like, well, actually, I don't even think that's a vulnerability. I don't think we put that on a post-it. I don't think you can actually do that. If that's the conversation, then do a spike. Just say, okay, well, I'm going to try and walk through that vulnerability and see if I can actually achieve it. So isn't it possible for somebody to override the authorization and log in as someone else? No, I don't think you can do that. Okay, well, we'll have a look into it. Or it might just be something general, right? Like team definition of done, if you like. So like injection's a great example of this. That are you using like the right sanitization when you take input and pass it to the database? Well, actually, if you're not, then you need to do that on every call to the database. It's not just this story. So consider adding something to your definition of done as a team to say, okay, whenever you're parameterizing a database query, do it in the right way. And then when you come to test the story, you can go through that list of things to check for, and your test team or however that's done. Your quality assurance can ensure that you've got a test for it and that it's properly sort of tested. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I really do think threat modeling is just, once you start doing it, it's really easy, but really valuable thing that you can do. What are you building? What can go wrong? What are you going to do about it? Make sure that you get that scope into your backlog. Bob to your uncle, really. Yeah, I mean, so that's all I've really got, really. I wanted to set, so I've written an article. So if you Google threat modeling, then you get an article that was published by a colleague of mine, Martin Fowler, which is like, probably would take you longer to read than what you just listened to. So value for money there. So that's a decent resource that I published that article. Martin Fowler's website is quite popular, so he's kind of like, he's got 300,000 followers, so it was quite an experience when that got published, that, you know, my Twitter, where I usually get like 1 like a month or something, it's just like sort of lit up, and that was kind of a fun experience for me. But it's not the only resource on threat modeling, and I just wanted to flag 2 other resources that I think are really good if you're interested in threat modeling, even if you're not a developer, right? Even if you're like, infrastructure's your thing, or if you're solely focused on security, there's just you know, threat modeling is a general thing. So there's the OWASP Slack, which is great actually. Go and ask questions. There's like 500, I think there's actually 900 now. This is an old slide. But join the threat modeling channel and ask questions there. Loads of great people have written books about threat modeling, people who do it for like the military and that kind of thing. So just get involved and ask questions there if you're interested in threat modeling. There's also a great Reddit subreddit that you can, where there's loads of great resources that are posted. So check those out. If you have any trouble getting into the OWASP Slack, then I'd say just ping. You can ping the chapter leaders, actually. Ping me via the meetup, and I can show you how to get into it. That's it. Thanks. Drop the mic.
That's great, Jim. Thank you. I've got a question for you, Jim.
I have a question.
Oh, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay, hi. Well, thanks very much for this presentation. I've attempted threat modeling on many occasions, and some, I don't know if I'm doing it right, if I'm getting it right. How does dread fit in? Where does dread fit in the threat modeling concept?
Yeah, thanks. So the question was, where does dread fit in? And so dread is it's another framework. It's a little bit like Stride in that it's a framework. So dread threat modeling. It's got its own Wikipedia article. Damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, discoverability. And the question was, where does dread fit in? So in the 3 questions, remember we said, well, what can go wrong? And then we did the prioritization. Dread is about the prioritization. So in the bit where I said, just do everyone gets 5 votes and you just go for your life, another approach that you could take is you could use the dread model. And so you could say, okay, what's the damage, what's the reproducibility, what's the exploitability? So you could use it there. Some would argue that it's more rigorous to do it in that kind of way. What I've experienced is I kind of just want to get a quick result, and I want to teach people to do threat modeling quickly. So I find it's easier to do the dot votes. If you've got a team who's very familiar with dread, then I certainly wouldn't argue moving away from it. If you wanted to do something that was even more sophisticated than dread, for sort of, well, the technical term would be risk evaluation. There's an interesting framework called, it's not called Open Fairways. I don't play golf. But it is called Open Fair, which is another risk evaluation framework that's kind of even more sophisticated than dread, if you like, where you get into, where's the images? There it is. Open Fair is quite interesting, actually. But you see in dread, you're saying damage, this is all kind of impact. With Open Fair, it breaks it down into like vulnerability, loss event frequency, resistance strength, and you can like properly put numbers behind it. But the thing is, once you start doing it, you could spend the whole month doing it, if you sort of mean. And the reason I like the dot voting is it's quick and easy. So a bit of a long answer there.
Okay, another one, please. In terms of the dot voting, because you know, the dot voting some is risk prioritization, And in terms of risk calculation, it has to, the standard doesn't have to exceed certain numbers. A good example, like when organization calculates risk in terms of that risk graph, you have 1 times 2 to 5 and all that. You shouldn't exceed 30. Is there a peg in terms of number, in terms of risk prioritization that we could use to say, okay, high, medium, low risk? Is there a standard for that figure, for that number to prioritize risk? So it could fit into this high, medium, low risk.
So there's not, as it turns out, that your organization may have a standard. But part of I'm a consultant, right? So I work with lots of different organizations. And so what I've learned is that there's, even different banks, even different government departments don't have a standard definition of high risk, medium risk, low risk. And so remember, what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to get developers to start doing threat modeling, because it's better that they do something than nothing, right? So I would say if your organization has got a definition of high, medium, low, use it, right? I mean, absolutely use it. But if you're in a dev team and you're just trying to get threat modeling off the ground, this works, right? Because people understand risk. People know the difference between bad and, well, that's never going to happen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim, we have a question from friend of the show, Dave Archer. Hello, Dave. Interesting question, actually. Well, it's an observation, actually, but wants your thoughts, Jim. So it strikes me that product owners and maybe wider business stakeholders should be involved in this process. Would you agree? Now, I think if product owners are in place, surely whatever slows down their product to market, they'll probably push back on. But Jim, what do you think?
I think it's a great point, and I think you should definitely try and get product owners involved in these sessions. I've seen some magic where you can get a product owner to come, and actually they think that security is all mumbo jumbo, and you say to them, well, if we haven't got the multi-factor authentication, then someone could steal all the money out of the bank. And do you know what I mean? It's just, it almost sounds patronizing, but it's, for product owners, it can be a real eye-opening moment. So I think it's perfect to get them involved. But I think the point there about it's challenging to get them involved is really true, actually, because it's almost not in their interest to have more scope that doesn't directly contribute to value. So it's yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think the more that it's a great way of engaging product owners, and the more that you should, but it ain't easy in some organizations.
Okay, hi. Then this brings me to my next question. Considering that you're from the software development background, as an expert in that sector, how would you advise that security should be baked or should be put at a different level of the software development lifecycle? How does security professional, because this has been quite a very difficult thing for me, getting my organization to develop software. My approach is from the early stage, design stage, try and get the threat modeling, right? Then somehow before go live, do pen testing. But I'm trying to see how best can I maximize, because some are defined at the threat modeling section. I'm trying to see, okay, at what else as a professional can I, how do I insert security at the different stages of the progression?
I think a lot of it is about, there's a whole technical side, there'd be another talk about SDLC, right? And it's a big technical topic, if you like, there's best practices, but the soft challenge is about establishing the value of security, and the value in security is risk. It's risk mitigation, right? So actually getting into your particular case, on this sort of, overlap thing, what is the impact if somebody steals your database? And trying to put a number on it, because there's no objective answers a lot of the time, but if it's in the order of 20 million quid, if somebody manages to get into something, then suddenly you've engaged people much higher up in the organization, right? And that frozen middle that's maybe like, oh, we just need to deliver so that, we tick the box. When they hear it coming from the top down, they're going to listen. So So I think there's a grassroots thing where you get the developers excited about it and get them thinking that security is interesting and fun. There's a top-down thing where you actually get some really good quantification, perfect, of what are the impacts if things go wrong. So you've got a sort of top-down and a bottom-up sort of approach. That's how I recommend doing it.
A couple of other observations, Jim, for you, actually. Adam, I don't know if you can answer this one, but Adam talks about NIST, risk assessment framework. But Adam, and actually I can't recall what the paper is on that one, but I'm
it's
sure
like 850. Yeah, I can't remember the number either. So there's loads of frameworks, right? There's like ISO 27005. There's the NIST one that we can't remember the number of. There's OpenFair that I flagged. There's all of these like formal risk assessment frameworks. The challenge that I try to solve is like, you've got a development team who is not a professional security team. They can have an unbelievable impact on the security of the system. All they need to do is think about it. And while it can be great to apply some of those frameworks, particularly if you've got the resource for it, and particularly at the organization level, you just want the devs to get started, if you sort of mean. So a little bit of dot voting, a little bit of like sort of cutting out the complexity, gets them to the real meat of it, which is what we build and what can go wrong and how can we fix it, really. But yeah, I mean, that all of the frameworks are great. You know, some are bigger, some are smaller, and you pick the one that's appropriate for you.
Okay, yeah, a couple of, you've got some good feedback on this from the chat, very relevant to some of the guys that are on. So great stuff, Jim.
Cool, no problem. Hope people found it useful.
I think so.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. My last question, please. Like transferring threat modeling, is it advisable? Because like from what you said, is there's no right way of doing it. There's no best practice or how to get, yeah. But as a professional, because I'm learning from you, like how is it advisable you leave it in that pictorial illustration design, or move it to an Excel file, Microsoft Excel file?
I think
your advice?
It depends on what works for your organization, fundamentally. I mean, there is a bit of a pattern of like having lots of risks in a spreadsheet. And I think there can be a danger that they get forgotten about. So I tend to think if you want something fixed, it needs to go in the backlog along with like all the other work the developers are doing, because otherwise it's the same as Trello, do you know what I mean? But if you have like a separate thing where you track the security stuff, it's just so much easier to forget it. So I would say in terms of like pragmatically reducing risk, just put it in your standard backlog. That's my advice. I do acknowledge that there are cases where you're doing like second line assurance. You would want to have a different, copy of it just for, sort of risk management and governance reasons. I acknowledge that. But I think if you want it done, just put it in the team's backlog. That's my advice.
Thank you again. And Adam, hand raised. Are you?
It was a quick question because you mentioned the rising of a stripe, where it's basically the potential that the exploitability of a potential risk or a potential threat was disputed. Could this raise requirements either for a non-staff member or the ability to engage in the wider community with experts in application exploitation?
I think so, yeah. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really technical, right? And like, for example, like David made a great comment earlier, like it's widely known that RSA, you could probably drive a bus through it. But like, how do you gauge that? Do you know what I mean? Does that mean that we need anything using RSA, we need to stop using it tomorrow? Like, does that mean that nation states can drive a bus through it? Does it mean that a kid in their bedroom? Like, a lot of these questions, they don't have simple answers, to be honest. So I think engaging with the wider community is great. I think having experts available is great, but I think you want to have a threat modeling process that's going to work even when you haven't got full information, because otherwise the danger is that you go, we haven't got all the information we need to make a decision, so we're going to do nothing. And I think that's the worst thing that you could do.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Cool. Well, we're just on time, Nate, I think.
Yes, that is excellent. So probably a good time then to be conscious of everyone's diaries and home lives, even though we've not got the bus or the train to catch anymore, but perhaps, like I said earlier on, perhaps at some point this year. So thanks, Jim, for that. Really good, really great talk. And Dave, again, thanks for being part of this. Thanks for coming on again. Probably, I think you're second in a couple of years, so really appreciate that. Thanks for your time. And
no worries, always welcome.
Yeah, no, well, we'll definitely get you back on, you know that. So just leaves it to me then to, well, Jim, we're going to we've recorded this, so if you could get the recording over to me, I'll get it onto YouTube. I'll advertise that on Meetup. And I just want to thank everyone for their attendance this evening. First one of 2021. Hopefully get another 2 or 3 done this year. So any volunteers, anyone knows anyone who wants to do a talk, colleagues, yourselves, or any subjects, of course, that you're really interested in, ping them over to me or Jim, and we'll see what we can do. OWASP do share speakers, and the one advantage of the virtual aspect is we can get people from for wherever they, all over the world, in fact, as long as time zones to suit, rather than perhaps onto centre of Birmingham. So that's an advantage that perhaps we can look at this year as well. So yeah, let us know if there's any subjects or any volunteers for speaking. But I'll just break up there and say thanks everyone. Thanks for the time. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.